In 1959, A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter M. Miller, Jr. was published. It's been in print ever since. It's considered a classic. Almost 40 years later, in 1997, St. Leibowitz and the Wild Horse Woman was published. This is the story of the 40-year gap and whether St. Leibowitz and the Wild Horse Woman is worth reading. Welcome to Vintage SF. I'm Richard Rempel. Before we talk about St. Leibowitz and the Wild Horse Woman, I think we need to look at the context here. Let's start off in World War II. World War II, just south of Rome, Monte Cassino, a town with a monastery up in the hills, an abbey of Benedictine monks. In 1944, the Allies wanted to take the town from the Germans. Bombers were sent in, fearing that the abbey was being used by the Germans. It was bombed as well. The abbey, which was established in 524 AD, now was in rubble. Many lives were lost. A radio man and tail gunner in one of the bombers? Walter M. Miller, Jr. This event would stay with Miller for the rest of his life. At the end of the war, he came home, married, had children, and began to write science fiction. A Canticle for Leibowitz was a fix-up of three stories brought together to form one novel. Following the critical and commercial success of A Canticle for Leibowitz, Walter M. Miller Jr. continued to publish short stories. There are many collections of his short stories, and Pocket Books in 1980 put out the best of Walter M. Miller Jr. But Miller's publisher and agent really wanted a follow-up to A Canticle for Leibowitz. Let's go to an article by Terry Bisson. A Canticle for Miller, or How I Met St. Leibowitz and the Wild Horse Woman, but not Walter M. Miller Jr., by Terry Bisson. I am a science fiction writer, a dicey business at best. In November 1995, I got a call from Don Congdon, a literary agent I knew by reputation but had never met. Congdon's a player. He represents William Styron and Ray Bradbury, among others. He asked if I had ever heard of a book called A Canticle for Leibowitz. I said yes, I had. Who hasn't? Canticle is one of the few science fiction books not only known but read outside the field, unlike, say, Dune or Stranger in a Strange Land, which render up their pleasures only to those already attuned to the genre. A novel of nuclear anxiety written in the 1950s, it tells the story of an order of monks in the Southwest and their efforts to keep scientific knowledge alive in the new dark age after the flame deluge or nuclear war. Leibowitz Abbey and the neighboring village of San Leibowitz are both named after a Los Alamos scientist who became a monk, was martyred by a mob, and is, just maybe, a saint. Leibowitz was Jewish, the joke of the title. The first major post-Holocaust SF novel, Canticle is a fix-up of three related novellas, which cover some 2,000 years, during which science is reborn and destroys civilization once again. It was a good year for the buzzards is Miller's persistent refrain. He didn't, to put it mildly, believe in progress. Further down, Don Congdon told me that Canticle's author, Walter M. Miller Jr., his client, had been working on a sequel for some 6 or 7 years, but the work had hit a stone wall. Miller was over 70. His health was bad, and he had been severely depressed for years. Congdon had suggested hiring a writer-editor to help finish the book, and Miller had agreed. Would I be willing to take a look at the manuscript? I said yes. I was thinking, hell yes. Further down in the article, Bisson receives the manuscript. Congdon gave me a box that weighed more than a small dog. I hauled it home before opening it. The manuscript inside was almost 600 pages long. I've been a writer long enough to know what it means to get stuck on a book. You meander, you fiddle, you rewrite, whatever. Miller had described his state to Congdon as like trying to spit through a screen. So I was expecting, as I said, a mess. I read all that afternoon and most of that night. I finished the book at 10 the next morning. It was brilliant. It was beautiful. It was almost perfect. There wasn't a line or a word out of place. This was no rough draft or heap of fragments, but a seamless, exotic, and incredibly rich masterpiece that motored along confidently, elegantly, and masterfully for 592 pages. and then stopped short. It even had a title, St. Leibowitz and the Wild Horse Woman. The story takes place at about the time of the second canonical novella, the 34th century. It's told from the point of view of a Leibowitzan monk, Blacktooth, and it concerns the struggle between the church in Denver and a rude and violent new empire in Texarkana. Caught in the middle are the mutant spooks who live in the hills and the horse nomads who rule the plains. Guns have just been reinvented, and Blacktooth travels with a worldly cardinal called Brown Pony, who is secretly arming the spooks and the nomads to fight on the side of the church. To complicate things, there is, of course, a girl, a beautiful, elusive, and irreverent young spook. And there's more, lots more. I called Congdon and told him I loved the book and wanted the job. Congdon sent my CV to Miller, who wrote back simply, "I've never heard of this guy, but he sounds okay to me." Earlier, he had assured Congdon that any idiot with a sense of humor can finish this book. I was in the ballpark anyway. While we waited for the okay from Bantam, Congdon filled me in on some history. St. Leibowitz and the Wild Horsewoman had been sold to Lou Aronica at Bantam some 7 years before for what publishers politely call mid-six figures. Aronica was long gone, first to Berkeley and then Avon, and we needed a go-ahead from Bantam's current leadership for me to finish the project. Most of the money was still unpaid, and it was not certain that they would want the book after all these years. But Congdon was sure he would be able to place it somewhere if need be. So was I. I cleared my decks for the project. I started taking notes, making plans, getting ready to get to work. I reread Canticle and was amazed how well it held up. Congdon and my agent, Susan Prodder, worked out a tentative deal that would get me out of debt. I was to get no credit on the cover, but that was okay with me. People in the genre and in the business would know I had done the job. We were still waiting to hear from Bantam when Congdon called me over Christmas saying, "I have some bad news. Walter killed himself yesterday." I was saddened and dismayed. I was also disappointed. Though I was assured I would probably still get the job, I had looked forward to meeting Miller and getting his approval of my work. Congdon disabused me of that notion. I was his agent for 40 years, and we never met in person. The family was understandably reluctant to release details of Miller's death, but gradually word leaked out. The irony was sharp. The third section of Canticle is a moving polemic against suicide. There were mixed feelings in the genre. Miller had not been popular. After his initial success, he had made enemies, then withdrawn from the SF community altogether. He had a prickly personality. He was estranged from his family as well. The estate was to be handled by his granddaughter, who made the effort to get to know him. She was an Arafat, raised in Texas with roots in the Middle East. This complex cultural legacy was another irony, perhaps appropriate to a writer who was so deeply conflicted about Catholicism and the West. Bantam finally gave their approval, and I went to work. Moving down to the last 2 paragraphs of the article. I'm only sorry I never got to meet the man I worked with so long and so intensely, even after his death. But that was never in the cards. Lucius Shepard told me a story right after I got the job. When he was living in South Florida, Lucius received a fan letter, an unheard of thing, from Walt Miller, who lived only a few miles away. It praised his writing at some length. Then, at the bottom, it said, "P.S. This does not mean I want to meet you. Good night, anyway, sweet prince, and thanks." So that is the story of why this novel was published posthumously. When reading the novel, I could really tell that the beginning of it was Miller's voice. Somewhere about halfway through, I started to notice passages that I thought perhaps were Bisson's. He claims that he wrote primarily the last 100 pages of this 434-page novel. So, is it any good? Well, obviously this is going to be a subjective opinion here. Miller had not really written a novel up to this point. A Canticle for Leibowitz was 3 novellas stitched together. This is a novel, but I found it somewhat convoluted. There is some great world building as we enter back into the lands of the mare. These are lands that formerly were known as Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado. Having traveled through these lands myself, it was really interesting to see how they were portrayed. This novel is set between the second and third part of A Canticle for Leibowitz, around 3400 to 3500 AD, 1500 years after the flame deluge. There are 3 nomadic tribes, Wild Dog, Grasshopper, and Jackrabbit. New Rome has been taken over by Texarkana. The papacy in exile is now at Vallana, near the Abbey of St. Leibowitz. The larger story is about the struggle to reunite the church under a new pope and to establish the papacy once again in New Rome. So why the title St. Leibowitz and the Wild Horse Woman? Well, the Wild Horse Woman is a legend of the nomad tribes. Our protagonist, Blacktooth, is from the nomadic tribes and was left as a young man at St. Leibowitz Abbey. He's a Catholic monk, but he has also seen a vision of the Wild Horse Woman. It's an interesting mix of indigenous and Christian faiths. As in A Canticle for Leibowitz, Miller is working out so much of his Catholic faith and disbelief. There's a soul searching in the story of Blacktooth. So once again, I ask myself, is this a novel I can recommend? It is a novel of world building. We learn so much more about the land of Mer and its inhabitants. We learn about the political system of electing a pope. And we look at the intrigue between Texarkana, its rulers, and the papacy. There is a strong story for Blacktooth, for a young woman that he loves, who is a mutant, a genie, someone who can pass within the non-mutant community. They would call them spooks. Although there's some very strong prose and sequences within this novel, I found it was missing puzzle pieces, let's say. It was very ambitious, but it just didn't quite hang together. I mentioned before it was a bit convoluted. So I recommend it to completists, those who would want to read all of Walter M. Miller Jr.'s work. I would also recommend it to people who would like to learn more about the lands and the politics of A Canticle for Leibowitz. But I can't recommend it as an overall story or novel. This is a case where the parts don't necessarily make a whole. For that reason, I reluctantly give it a 6 out of 10. For those of you who've read it, I would love to hear your opinion. And if you haven't read it, is this something that you do plan to read? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, keep reading.